Hello, and welcome to Political-psych with Abby, where I talk about the psychology of politics. Today I'm going to be talking about climate anxiety, which is one of my most requested topics. I know it might seem strange, but I want to start off this video with the reasons I have been putting off doing the video. The first is, well, honestly, my own climate anxiety. This stuff really stresses me out. Ironically, it was my climate anxiety getting worse that got me to finally decide to get to work on this video. As most of you probably know, there were catastrophic wildfires in Canada this past summer, and the smoke drifted southwards and led to long periods of appalling air quality in much of the US. I live in Chicago, and we did not get the absolute worst of it. The sky wasn't orange, just the scariest gray I have ever seen. I did not even know that it was possible for gray to be scary. Anyway, I have what is usually pretty mild asthma, but as it turns out, my asthma is very reactive to pollution. Like, my inhaler had stopped working because of lack of use, but when the smoke hit, I needed an emergency refill because without my inhaler, I felt incredibly sick the moment I took a step outside and for hours afterwards. Even with it, I could still feel the smoke curled up, sitting at the bottom of my lungs. I could feel the climate crisis inside my body. I was terrified. I ended up bringing it up to my therapist, and she did have some useful advice. I also told her about my hesitation to make a video on this topic. She advised me that I should just jump in and do it, because it is healthy to confront these things head on. The second reason I was hesitant to make this video is that I am not a mental health professional. I took a couple of clinical psych classes in undergrad, but my focus has always been more on the social psychology end of things. I don't tend to talk a lot about mental health on this channel because while it is super important to talk about, it is not what this channel is about. Still, I think that this is an instance where mental health affects political action in some pretty profound ways. So we should talk about it here. That being said, if this is something that you are really struggling with on a personal mental health level, please seek help from a mental health professional. I know that it can be tough to access these services, so I will link some resources developed by mental health professionals below. I want to say that I'm primarily going to be treating climate anxiety as a feeling in this video rather than a specific diagnosis. It is not typically treated as a diagnosis, although severe climate anxiety can seriously impact day-to-day functioning and well-being. For most people, feeling anxiety and other negative emotions about the climate crisis does not impair them especially severely day to day. Like many things in psychology, it is probably useful to think of this as on a spectrum. Having some anxiety about climate change is much more common than experiencing the sort of climate anxiety that makes it difficult to function. When I say that I deal with climate anxiety, I do not mean that I have been diagnosed with climate anxiety or that it makes it super difficult for me to function like every day. But I have, on occasion, experienced so much anxiety about the climate crisis that it does make my life considerably worse for a period of time. For full transparency, I should mention that I have not actually been diagnosed with anxiety more generally either, although I probably could, or at least could have been in the past. But I will give a brief overview of my own history with anxiety. I was a kind of generally nervous kid. Like, my mom had to climb playgrounds ahead of me to show me that they were safe. I was such a weenie, honestly, it's kind of embarrassing now. I was in therapy when I was very little and occasionally as a teenager. This is linked to some family stuff that is really beside the topic of this video. I was really more numb than anxious until I got to university, at which point, instead of caring very little about most things in my life, I started caring too much about everything in my life and had a series of panic attacks. I was medicated for the panic attacks, but I don't remember what I was on because I had memory loss associated with said panic attacks. The medication, along with lifestyle changes and therapy, did help me stop having panic attacks. I was only on the medication briefly because it made me depressed, but it was worth it because it helped stop the panic attacks. This experience actually led me to finally start taking steps outside my comfort zone because I realized that nearly any outcome was better than being paralyzed with anxiety, and that really not caring about anything was maybe even worse than that anxiety. I've had ups and downs since, but I'm doing pretty well right now mental health wise generally, and while I still get anxious, I have not had a panic attack since my first year of college. As a feeling, anxiety can be motivating, paralyzing, and bad. It is also typically unpleasant. Those things can exist in almost any combination in a person, and we all experience some amount of anxiety. That being said, it is also fine and good to talk to a professional about feelings of anxiety, even if they would likely not meet the threshold for diagnosis. You don't have to be mentally ill to benefit from mental health services. There are also a lot of things you can do to deal with feelings of anxiety more generally that don't require involving a professional. I will be talking about one specifically relevant to climate anxiety later in this video. I don't have any specific qualifications to give general self care advice, but personally, I am a fan of spending time with and keeping contact with friends and family, regular exercise, adequate sleep, hobbies, and periodic breaks from social media and phones. The boring stuff that help you be a happy, functional person. I do get how not all of these are achievable for everyone. That's why we need to do a better job of caring for each other on a societal level in order to make that possible. Okay, let's have a more formal definition of climate anxiety before we really get into things. Eco anxiety or climate anxiety is the experience of environment related distress and encompasses negative emotions like fear, guilt, shame, hopelessness, and despair. Although exactly how it should be defined is still a matter of some debate. I mean, basically, every term in the social science has some debate about it and its usage, but this debate is still in what I would call the squishy stage. We'll get into that a bit later. You might be wondering how common climate anxiety is. That can be difficult to say because it varies based on context and definition. I think that the report on climate change in the American mind, beliefs and attitudes December 2022 does a really good job summarizing Americans' emotional experience around climate change in terms of percentages. So I'll quote their executive summary of the topic in full. A majority of Americans, 64%, say they are at least somewhat worried about global warming. This includes about 1 in 4, 27%, who say they are very worried. More than half of Americans, 58%, say they feel interested when thinking about global warming. 4 in 10 or more say they feel frustrated, 48%, hopeful, 41%, sad, 40%, or disgusted, 40%. Fewer say they feel angry, 35%, afraid, 34%, outraged, 34%, anxious, 32%, hopeless, 29%, or depressed, 23%. About 1 in 10 Americans report experiencing symptoms of anxiety because of global warming for several or more days out of the last 2 weeks. Almost as many report experiencing symptoms of depression because of global warming. About 1 in 4 Americans, 27%, say they try not to think about global warming, and 15% say they try to avoid information about global warming. About 1 in 10 say they often have trouble stopping themselves from consuming bad news about global warming, 11%, or seek social or emotional support to manage their concerns about global warming. 8% of Americans say they are discussing their feelings about global warming with a counselor or therapist or would be interested in doing so. The thing about climate anxiety is that it makes sense to have it, at least to some extent. Like, it is rational. That means it's not something that you can fix completely with conventional therapy, and even if it was, taking that approach would still probably be wrong. That's because anxiety can be adaptive, or in other words, can prompt us to do things that need doing. Now, I've had the bad anxiety, the kind that is definitely not helpful. Most people have probably had that at some point too. Emotions are imprecise things after all. Multiple studies across multiple countries have found, though, that climate anxiety correlates with climate action. Climate action can include things like recycling and also collective actions like protests and organizing. The correlation between anxiety and action does prompt the unfortunate question of whether participating in climate action makes your climate anxiety worse. And yeah, I'm not going to say that engaging with climate change more frequently is not anxiety producing. It absolutely can be. However, there is fairly strong evidence that climate action, specifically collective action, which is action you do with other people, is a good way to deal with your climate anxiety. If you're interested in the importance of taking a collective approach more generally, you should check out my video on solidarity. Anyway, back to the more specific matter at hand. Schwartz et al. Found that among those experiencing climate anxiety, engaging in collective action made them feel less depressed. Importantly, engaging in individual action did not do the same. The sense of community one gets from collective action seems instrumental in dealing with climate anxiety. This is one of the nifty instances where caring for others is self-care. I think it is worth pointing out that Whitmarsh et al. Found that the strongest predictor of climate anxiety was seeking out information related to climate change. Now, I'm absolutely all for staying informed. The issue is that, unlike activism, information seeking does not typically give the same sense of community as activism. This is why I think it is so important for one's mental health as well as for one's impact on the world to focus on seeking out the information you need to have a positive impact rather than doom scrolling. However, it is very possible that many of those who engage in information seeking around climate change are essentially already taking that advice, because anxiety may be motivating them to seek information which tells them how they can be effective in combating climate change, thereby increasing efficacy beliefs and probably also climate action as a consequence of that. Speaking of doom and agency, let's talk about hope. One of my favorite articles that I read while doing research for this video is Sangervo et al.'s article, Climate Anxiety, Conceptual Considerations and Connections with Climate Hope and Action. They found that the results showed, in line with the model and the hypothesis, that the anxiety index and hope index had unique and positive effects on our indexes for climate action, and that experiencing both those feelings simultaneously explained approximately 4 to 5% more variance in climate action than either emotion does on its own. What that means in non-social science lingo is that hope and anxiety combined have more influence on climate action than either does separately. It's a greater than the sum of its parts type thing. Basically, the idea is that if you have only anxiety and no sense of hope and agency, you'll probably wallow in doomerism and won't do anything. And if you only have hope, you might not have a sense of urgency and therefore might not do very much. Regarding efficacy, Hart and Feldman found that media messaging regarding how effective we can be on climate issues did affect perceptions of people's own efficacy and the likelihood that people will take action. I should explain some terms before we dive more fully into the article. External efficacy reflects individuals' belief about the government's responsiveness to citizens' demands. Internal efficacy is a personal sense that you can understand politics and act effectively in the political realm. In other words, if you have low external efficacy, you think the politicians and the government are useless. And if you have low internal efficacy, you think you are useless. To quote the article, overall, the results revealed that after a single exposure to a news stories, including positive internal efficacy content, increased perceived internal efficacy, while stories including negative external efficacy content lowered perceived external efficacy. There were limited impacts of other types of efficacy content on perceived efficacy. Anyway, what this all means is that it's important to spread messages that make people feel like they can do something about the climate crisis. If you want people to try doing something, it's good to make them feel like that actually matters. So yeah, doomerism might actually doom us all. Of course, anxiety, even as broadly as it's defined in these contexts, is not the only negative emotion people might experience about climate change. There are also some emotions that I'm not covering in this video. I would say that I don't have the emotional bandwidth, but really I don't have the digital bandwidth to upload a file that large to YouTube. There are, however, some additional emotions that I think I should talk about today. So let's talk about anger. A study by Stanley et al. Using an Australian National Survey data sample examined eco-anger and found that it predicted better mental health better personal environmental behaviors, and more climate activism. The authors do not go into a ton of detail regarding why this might be, but seem to suggest that it might have to do with being able to give negative emotions a direction other than towards oneself. This actually makes a lot of sense to me. We are often made to feel like the crisis is our individual fault, when it typically is not. I doubt any of the people watching this video could reasonably be blamed for a significant chunk of it. I mean, maybe my audience contains billionaires with large stakes in fossil fuels and polluting companies, or the politicians, lobbyists, and consultants, and various hanger ons who take their money. If that does describe you, please kindly reconsider your life choices. I'm begging you, it's not too late to change for the better. But yeah, most of us should feel angry at those who, for generations, have put profits over our collective well being. Oh, yeah, and those big companies have the gall to blame us. Did you know that the concept of the personal carbon footprint was invented by BP to deflect our anger from them? I mean, if you watch this channel, you probably do already know that because I bring it up a lot, but still. Basically, what I'm saying is if you want to live more sustainably, that's good, but you can't be blamed for living in an unsustainable society. Instead, you should try and change that society. Climate change isn't your fault. It is your responsibility, but it's everyone else's responsibility too. So we just have to share that responsibility in a productive way. I can totally see why anger would both improve mental health and encourage activism. Yesterday, from the day I'm writing this, I went to a fairly large climate march. When the speakers brought up the negligence or profit motivated evil of specific companies and individuals, you could literally see it galvanizing and energizing the crowd and bringing us together as a group. Normally, I'm a love over anger type of person, but a lot of this anger is born out of love. Climate destruction threatens everyone and everything I love, so of course I'm going to be angry at those causing it. Interestingly, this same study found that those experiencing eco anxiety were not more likely to participate in climate action, but those experiencing eco depression were. I should clarify that the authors do not say that participating in climate action makes people more depressed. It's a correlation, and there are a number of things that could cause it. But I have not encountered any researchers suggesting that taking action on climate change is bad for you or makes you depressed. You might also be wondering if the fact that they did not find a connection between climate anxiety and climate action means that you wasted your time watching this video. Well, I should say that different studies getting different results does not necessarily mean that any study involved is actually wrong. Social science, especially, is mushy like that. Not all of these studies are using the same definitions and measures of climate anxiety and climate action. The studies I discussed in this video also varied in terms of who was participating and where. There does seem to be enough evidence that collective action on climate issues helps with at least some of the types of climate anxiety, that if you're experiencing climate anxiety, you should try it. And there is also fairly robust evidence that climate anxiety and emotions in general can be motivating in really helpful ways on climate issues. What remains is to work out more detail, and there is so much more detail to figure out. One of the things I did to escape from the worst of my anxiety and stop having panic attacks was to stop taking anxiety motivated actions. This did help in that I stopped having panic attacks and also became a better and much more fun person, but it occasionally backfired. I am looking at you, terrible second year living situation I should have backed out of, and a 2-year relationship with a man too depressed to love me. That's the way he described it. So now I listen to anxiety occasionally. But yeah, it can be really tough when you don't feel like you can trust yourself. That's why it's so important to talk to other people who can tell you when your anxiety is reasonable and when it isn't. And most of the time with climate change, it is. You can also work with others to figure out how you can most sensibly take action or not take action. From personal experience, I can say that it is best if you can find people to talk to who are also passionate about protecting the environment and the well being of the human species, but who are not of an anxious disposition themselves. I will give two examples of moments of climate anxiety for me, one with anxiety that should not be listened to, and one where it should, and how another climate activist, in this case my husband, helped me through them. Let's start with when it was not reasonable to take action at that moment based on my particular anxieties. This was around the time of the wildfires. I was working close to full time as a researcher on a project about climate change, as well as volunteering with a local environmental organization. Late at night, I just started freaking out that I was not doing enough and that nothing I was doing mattered. My husband very kindly explained that that was nuts. I'm one of those people that needs that kind of honesty and directness, and suggested we relax and then have a good night's sleep. In another instance, I was anxious that the environmental group I volunteer with was not having the reach it could because the social media we were running was not being as well run as it could be. I expressed this to my husband, and then I developed a plan of how we can do our social media better and presented this plan to the relevant committee, and we decided to enact it, which made me feel a lot better and less anxious. Of course, now I have the stress of actually applying this strategy, but at least that is productive. Like, literally, I need to take a break from writing this script right now to deal with it. Basically, what I'm saying is that anxiety and other negative emotions can be a powerful force for good in the fight against climate change, but that we need to be careful with them. I want to emphasize, though, that carefulness does not mean shying away from them. It means addressing and channeling them together with our comrades. Speaking of comrades, I want to thank my lovely patrons for supporting the channel. If you want to join them and get some exclusive content, there's a link in the description. There are also links if you want to follow me on social media, and of course, don't forget to like, subscribe, and even hit that little bell. Bye! See you next time, everybody.